Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. No single social issue has been as much of a political and theological flashpoint in my lifetime as abortion. We stand today at a unique historical moment that many of us thought would never come. The Supreme Court's nearly 50-year-old ruling in Roe v. Wade has been overturned, and these United States are in the process of crafting their own democratically enacted laws on the question of abortion. For my entire life, being opposed to the legal killing of unborn children was seen as a cornerstone of evangelical political engagement, and in fact, the leading reason why evangelical Christians should vote and participate in politics. But that opposition to abortion wasn't always so clear or unanimous, and it has led some to wonder whether evangelical Protestants can really claim, as our Catholic friends can, to have a consistent and historical witness on this vital political and moral question. Well, my guest today thinks that such a witness does exist and that it has roots deep in the soil of Christian history and thought. Steven Wedgeworth is the rector of Christ Church Anglican in South Bend, Indiana. He's written for Desiring God Ministries, the Gospel Coalition, the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and Mere Orthodoxy. He also served as a founding board member of the Davenant Institute. He's just contributed a chapter on abortion to a new book from Davenant entitled Protestant Social Teaching, an Introduction, and I welcome him today to talk about that. Steven, welcome back to Upstream.
Thanks, Shane. Great to be here.
Well, you wrote the introduction to this book, and before we kind of get into abortion, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about this project, Protestant Social Teaching, and its purpose. Because one of the questions you deal with is whether a Protestant social teaching, as opposed to a Catholic social teaching, actually exists.
Sure. So I've got a copy of the book here, Protestant Social Teaching. You can get it wherever good books are sold, so everyone go out and grab a copy. And the title, hopefully, frames the idea right away that we wanted to put forward a testimony that the Protestant Reformation, and we define some of this in the book, we're talking mainly about Lutherans, Anglicans, Reformed, Presbyterian. I made a mistake on a previous podcast. I said also Baptists represented, and Brad Littlejohn said, well, actually, we didn't have any Baptists. But we think, at least a healthy dose of Baptists will also be able to tie into this sort of heritage. It's coming from the Protestant Reformation, and it is a collection of moral teachings, moral, social, political teachings, and the book covers a wide range. We have an introduction on what is law, what does that word even mean, what is a government, civil magistrate, how do Christians think about war, marriage, procreation and child rearing, divorce, abortion, end-of-life issues. We have chapters on labor, work, the use of property and money. So it's meant to be a survey of Protestant thinking on all of these moral topics. Now, the title might make a lot of people think about Catholic social teaching, and that was intentional. We wanted that kind of idea to come up in people's minds. But what we try to demonstrate is we're not copying that, but we're actually reaching back into the 16th, 17th century, and we're showing how the reformers were themselves carrying on conversations that predated them. The Middle Ages, early church, even Judaism in the Old Testament.
How does a Protestant social teaching actually work in contrast with the Catholic one? Because the obvious missing element here is a kind of teaching magisterium. There's not an institutional body for Protestants that speaks on behalf of the whole tradition and says, this is our interpretation of divine revelation on all of these moral issues. So in what sense can we speak of a Protestant social teaching or a kind of united testimony? On what authority are the writers of that subject speaking?
Sure. So that's one of the obvious differences. In the 20th century, I think it's Humanae Vitae, the statement that the Catholic Church makes on procreation contraception. They have a line in there that the magisterium is the guardian and interpreter of the natural law or the moral law. And so they're making a claim that at the end of the day, any debates about what is moral law goes through them, the Pope, his magisterium. So we don't have that as Protestants. We don't have a singular institution that does that. But we do have a conviction in natural law, the light of reason, that shows up in many of our confessional documents. There's also the understanding that there's sort of common law, that is, shared interpretations not only across the ages in one tradition, but across the ages in a multiple collection of traditions. So, places where the Reformed and the Lutheran agree, and even places where they agree with the Catholics or with the Middle Ages or early church, that's a pretty strong testimony. So we don't say that, okay, we have a magic wand. We just give you the answer book. ABC, here you go. But we can show you how wise Christians studying and meditating on common sources came to very similar conclusions. And we also try to show you how they got there, the premises, the logic, and so forth.
One of the premises of the book is really that Protestants should both care about and be involved in the making of laws. And of course, this undergirds your chapter very much, that we're not kind of quietist. We don't say that our job is to just do the church things off on the side here and then let the civil society sort itself out, right? There's a basis upon which we engage with civil society on moral issues. So talk to us a little bit about that basis, because abortion is where, for most people, it's like the moment when we have to make that decision, when we have to say, as Christians, it is our duty to help craft laws, elect candidates, get judges appointed who will be just on this issue, who will protect life. So what's your rationale, or what's the Protestant rationale for being involved in government?
So being involved in government is basically, first and foremost, a human thing. All humans have some connection to this. This is part of the dominion mandate given to Adam in the garden. It's also just an inescapable fact of living with other humans. So we're all going to have some say in government. Different governments have existed over the years. We live now in one that is more democratic, more popular. All citizens are invited to participate in a certain way. So that's an initial basis right there. Everyone's going to have to do it, so we need to do it as well. And then as Christians, it's a bit of a tightrope, because we don't want to say, and I think sometimes some of us do say wrongly, that we have this totally unique insight that no one could ever get unless they become a Christian and hold our views and have it all together. And that's a little tricky. That's a bit of a trump card, right? You use that when all other arguments have failed, but it doesn't help when you live in a society with people that don't all share those views, right? It just becomes a bit of a shouting match. So we don't want to say that, but we do want to say there's a basic moral guide that everyone has on some level, and then the scriptures and our tradition illuminate that they clarify that, they put it together in ways that strengthen it. And so we can point to that common thing that everyone has some connection to, and then we can show how our understanding of it is more consistent, has more integrity, and is ultimately better for humanity.
That appeal to a natural law that's accessible to everyone. And then, of course, taking it back to the origin of mankind itself and our common life together as people on this earth, as creations, right? It's interesting, and I think that's really important. I've had conversations with folks like David Haynes on the podcast about natural law and why it's important to the making of human laws, of civic laws. I want to really highlight that because I saw a conversation yesterday. Many of my listeners will have seen this conversation. It was between Joe Rogan and Matt Walsh. And this was a clip from a much larger exchange that they had on the Joe Rogan podcast. But Rogan had asked Walsh why he's against gay marriage. How does it hurt your heterosexual marriage if gay people get married in law, right? This is an old question going back long before Obergefell. And Walsh was kind of trying to make a common sense case for marriage needing to have a real definition. It can't just be subjective. It can't be whatever you want. And he's talking very much in societal terms, macro terms. Rogan wanted to talk more in individual terms. But this is interesting because a lot of commenters on that video were saying, hey, Matt Walsh, you should have just said because God says this is what marriage is, because the Bible says marriage is a man and a woman and so forth. And the obvious retort by someone like Joe Rogan is, well, why should I care? Why should the, large percentage of our citizens in this country who don't hold the Bible in authority and don't follow the Christian God and maybe don't even believe in him care what he thinks about marriage? And the same sort of thing happens with abortion. And that's where I think we need to be very, very careful about invoking divine authority in Scripture as our primary or first reason for wanting to legislate on this issue, for trying to make this case in law, that we shouldn't kill unborn human beings. That should be illegal. Why? Well, yes, because God says so, but God doesn't only speak to us in religious text, right? There's a basis on which we can make this case in law, in the public square, without quoting Bible verses. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree largely with that. I want to be careful that I don't actually believe it's a choice in either or. I don't want to give that impression like, oh, well, this one way, it's only going to be helpful for some people. This way is the better way. Honestly, they go together. There are two books for the book of nature, the book of Revelation, with a common author. And the more you read them together, the stronger they both appear. They become more consistent. So I definitely don't want to shelve the kind of uniquely Christian angle. But what I want to do is I want to show how the Christian angle connects to the natural. It unites both of those worlds. And hopefully, with someone like Joe Rogan, he's going to feel some connection there. He may resist some of it. He may say, oh, no, I don't believe in this or that, but it's still going to hit him on a heart level. He's going to meditate on it. And a guy like that, even though, I think he would say he's an atheist, he is really interested in kind of transcendental, psychic, mental, spiritual concepts. And so you'd like to think that it would just percolate in his mind, right? You want to keep that there. But, right, you want to make sure that you're pressing him on every angle. So if there's the one appeal that he just quickly deflects from, then you want to hit him on another angle where he can't so easily deflect from. And you want to push a unified, coherent understanding of the world.
So how would you make the case against abortion as a Protestant? In other words, what are the distinctive features of the approach or the kind of elevator pitch that you are suggesting here? Because I think we're all pretty familiar with basic pro-life apologetics, but what does the Protestant tradition bring to this discussion in your view?
Yeah. So what I show in my book, my chapter in the book, it's largely a historical survey. I go through early church and ancient Judaism and what they had to say about the topic into the Middle Ages and the Reformation. And what I show is that what seems to be common to everyone is a conviction that sex and procreation are connected. So the purpose of human sexuality, having sex, is largely to have children. Now, we could talk about exceptions. Those are other chapters, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on our conversation about the exceptions. But that's a big argument. And you see that in, again, Judaism, early church, Middle Ages, Reformation. The Reformers don't really break on that. They do bring out maybe more of an emphasis on the friendship that is involved in marriage, the unitive action between man and wife, where they are bringing love and affection and enjoyment. I think that comes out more strongly in the Reformers, but they don't use that to nullify or cancel procreation. So those go together, and this is for the establishing of a family or a household. And so that's the first common plank. And in my mind, that's going to be where our immediate battle is, right? I mean, most modern people are going to balk at that, even fellow Christians. So before we even get this argument out and are able to kind of lay siege to non-believers, we're going to have to do a lot of work within the church. So that's the first plank. And then the second plank is that there was a lot of confusion over early term abortion. And so you do see debates in Judaism. There are at least three positions on this. One of them is a more absolutist, no abortion ever, but there are at least two views within early Judaism that allow for certain kinds of abortions. And it's because of their particular understanding of when the soul comes into the body. That's a big part of it. And you see that in the early church as well. There's some division there. Now, it's not what you'll commonly hear. You'll commonly hear, well, that all of them held to delayed ensoulment, which then would allow for early term abortion. That's actually not true. There were early Christians who rejected that whole concept, but it's a debate. It's there. So I talk about that. Now, it's still only very, very early. They're drawing from Aristotle, and he's kind of got an odd view about, well, it takes 40 days for the soul to arrive in males, and then twice as long for females. So even that isn't really going to be what modern people are looking for. But
good old Aristotle, always good for a take on women that just makes modern people cringe.
Yeah, no, Aristotle. For people that aren't familiar, he's got a line where he says, "Oh, women are deformed men." So you see that here. We don't want to go with that. And it's important to know that both Calvin and Luther, when they talk about the image of God in Genesis, they don't name Aristotle, but they do say that the heathens have made this argument that women is a malformed, deformed man. And they say this is an insult to God and his dignity. They reject that. But so there's division over this. There is an early term, and then when you get to the Reformation, you start to see that getting shut down, and you start to see less and less division, and you see different kinds of arguments for why. But it's interesting that they are pushing the creation of the soul and the human life back to conception. And you see this clearly in Calvin, and it starts to become more and more common in both Lutherans and Reformed. And it's interesting, they're not using modern science. They're kind of using philosophy and theology. So now that we in the 21st century can use both, we can use the advances of science and their contributions. They really help us to have a more robust and fully rounded argument.
So, Stephen, I'm getting this impression that there is a fairly united Christian witness shared in common between Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox historically, long before these splits take place in history, on the abortion issue, that this is not good. And there are reasons why it's not good, and some of those reasons vary, but we have this kind of common understanding that killing unborn children is wrong. Ending in pregnancy deliberately is wrong. And you even cite the word from the Didache, where it says it actually condemns the use of potions or chemicals to end a pregnancy. That's a kind of common belief that was put into place or recognized very early on as part of the quote unquote teaching of the apostles. I'm interested. I think we should go back to the history in a second, but I want to contrast it with what I mentioned in the intro, because when you talk to people about this who know a little bit about American evangelical history at all of an argumentative nature and have pro-choice convictions, will throw this in your face. They'll say, well, look, Shane, look, Stephen, it's all well and good for you to, tout your pro-life credentials now, but not so long ago in this country, American evangelicals, major denominations, major publications were in favor of abortion, or at least allowed it in a lot of circumstances. We're shockingly open to abortion, even for things like emotional distress in the mother. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I don't want listeners to be blindsided by the reality on this. And you really face it full on in your chapter.
Yeah, thanks. That's towards the beginning of the chapter. So the way that I form it is I say, you commonly encounter that objection, which you just mentioned. And I said, and we got to be honest, in the early 20th century or middle 20th century, that is definitely true. The Episcopal Church is the first one to allow for abortion. Now, when they allow for it, it's still a pro-choice kind of allowance, but they are guarded. They say that it's only if things are going, health or emotional damage. We really should try to avoid it. So they aren't like guns blazing, but they do allow it. And then shockingly, the Southern Baptists come out with pretty much the same statement. They say abortion is allowable if it's the life of the mother, but then they also say her health, her emotional health and well-being, or if there's a chance of deformity in the child, which is really, really pretty shocking right, for us to hear that now. But they say that, Southern Baptist Convention, that's actually one of their first statements on the topic, 1971. That's when they make that kind of statement. And I actually put the Baptist and the Episcopal side by side, and they're not really very different. I mean, those two churches are basically saying the same thing. And then really shocking, the OPC, super turbo conservatives, right? They took this issue up in 1970, 70 and 71, and they come back divided. They have a split report. Naysayers will say, well, it only takes one person for a minority report. And that's true. They only had one person on the minority report, but he was important. It was Paul Woolley, who was a founding professor at Westminster, associate of Machin, so not insignificant. And Woolley is pro-choice. So this is a reality. We have to realize this. But what I demonstrate is that they are not representing what had always been the case. They are actually representing a very recent turn in their own traditions. And so they've already gotten rid of that connection of sex and procreation. That's kind of already happened. They've made that break. And then with Woolley, he gives you his rationale, which is really telling. He says, the case against abortion relies too much on philosophy. There's not enough direct biblical text here. And he says it's rationalistic and it's of a Roman Catholic tendency. So what Woolley is doing is he's actually exhibiting that kind of biblicism that creeps in the 20th century. And yes, apologies to our friends at Westminster, but it was fairly common at Westminster in the middle 20th century to be all in on biblical theology and to be rather skeptical on more philosophical or scholastic approaches. And so Woolley is actually showing you a particular twist, and I would say a regression away from the previous Protestant consensus. And so he's in line with pro-choice because he's modern, not because he's Presbyterian or Reformed. And I demonstrate that in the rest of my chapter. Yeah, showing you the 16th, 17th, even up into the 19th centuries.
Well, interact with his claim there, if you would, for a moment, because he's claiming that, in essence, the Bible doesn't say a lot on the abortion issue, that you need to resort to extra biblical reasoning and philosophical sources and just, behave like the Catholics if you want to make the case against abortion. But to go to the Bible is to find an ambiguous witness on abortion. What do you think about that? Is that an accurate read on the situation?
So, I can certainly understand why he says that, because if you just grab a concordance, look up abortion, you probably won't find much. Now, some of that is just because of the history, right? They wouldn't have had the medical technology, they didn't use the language, but it does show up in the scriptures in a few places. The classic text is Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25. And this is a bit of an odd case law when two men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out. But if there is no harm, the one who hit her shall be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose. But if there is harm, then you should pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, etc. And so that's in Exodus. Now, the way that I read it, I was using the Hebrew Masoretic. That gives you a much stronger pro-life angle. If there is no harm, it seems most likely it's talking about the child that comes out. Because, obviously there's some measure of harm. They hit the woman and caused this thing to happen. So there's got to be some harm to her. But if there's no harm to the child, then you fine rather than kill. So that gives you some real strong idea that, hey, if you cause the life of the child to terminate, that's a murder. So that's in there. Now, there's a debate about that. If you use the Septuagint, then you have some of this ensoulment questions, which I treat in some detail. But Woolley is not going to want to do that. So I think we can use Exodus 21. But also I show in the other biblical passages about the life inside the womb. We have psalm teachings, we have teachings of the prophets about God knowing the entity in the womb, forming it, giving it a direction and a destiny, and also the purpose and goal. The so this is where Woolley wouldn't like this. He said, "Oh, you're using philosophy," but our tradition says we can use good and necessary consequences. This is how we establish many of our doctrines. You put things together. And so, say, take the Westminster Larger Catechism and how it treats the Ten Commandments. Well, each of those Ten Commandments implies a set of duties and prohibitions. And so you would take that same reasoning to the act of sex, to the act of bearing children, to the act of terminating, the life of a child, and then you would simply apply the moral law. Thou shalt not kill, certainly, how to love our neighbors, and honestly, the child in the womb, it's even more of an extreme case than a living child. So this is a lowly, needy little child, right? What do the scriptures tell us about children? We're not to prevent them from coming to Christ. We're not to discourage them. We're not to mistreat them. And I think we could say we're not to kill them. We're to try to help them grow up and become the kind of person that can love and honor God. And so that to me is not overly speculative. That's not high flying medieval scholasticism. That's just really taking basic systematic thinking. And the fact that we have a tradition that does that strengthens our case dramatically.
I think every time I have talked with someone who makes a claim a bit like Woolley is making, that the Bible is kind of ambiguous on the question, obviously I love the strategy of just going in, digging in and finding out what the real implications of some of its statements and passages are. But I also like to sort of take the strategy of substituting a different moral issue that we all feel very strongly about, but which the Bible says little to nothing about directly. So my go-to example is cannibalism, right? I cannot think of a passage of scripture that treats directly with cannibalism, certainly not in a moral sense, as in, saying yay or nay, right? And yet we all feel very strongly about that. And I would hope we all feel strongly about that and would agree that God feels strongly about it as well. We don't, I think, seriously wonder at night whether Jesus was ambiguous on the question of cannibalism. I think we probably would expect Jesus to say, no, you should not eat people. That's a bad thing to do. Aside from just the killing of the people, right? The eating of them is not a good thing to do either. And yet the Bible actually doesn't say anything explicitly about that. So what gives? Is it true that we need to have a thus saith the Lord in a specific sense on every moral issue? Or can we use that sort of what you call good and necessary consequence to arrive at some of these conclusions? I think even the strongest biblicist would have to, at the end of the day, say, yeah, there are things the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn that we should nevertheless be very confident about because it's an outworking of principles that are in the Bible.
Yeah, and I think with Woolley, he's really just betraying a very 20th century notion, because the older position would sort of be, well, show me a good argument for doing this thing, which is apparently morally dangerous, right? It wouldn't be the reverse. It wouldn't be, oh, I can do this thing unless you make a strong argument. I would say, well, this is a little tricky. I'm going to need proof in order to go forward.
Right. One of the interesting observations that you make as you survey Christian history on the abortion issue, and you zoom in on the church fathers, one of the interesting observations you make is that the fathers opposed abortion, but they had different reasons for doing so. So they're actually more opposed to abortion than the Jewish tradition that came before them. But their reasoning varies from writer to writer. Talk to us about the differences that exist there, and whether we should be kind of troubled by that.
Yeah, I think it's the wild world of late antiquity, because they think so differently than we do on many, many issues. So I was saying earlier that many of them hold to this view of delayed ensoulment. And so what that means is that they don't oppose abortion simply because it's murder. because they don't think the soul has come in yet. But they do oppose it as contraception. And they say, well, it's not murder per se, but it's contraception. So you can't do that either. So that really surprises moderns. And the only wiggle room that would be there would be, cases of, life of the mother, like physical life. Then you could have some conversation about that. But otherwise, they're going to be pretty much, no, you can't do it because it's a perversion of the use of sex and procreation. You can't do it. Now, other church fathers just say, oh, it's absolutely a living human soul right out of the gate. St. Basil of Caesarea is one of these guys. He says, we don't care about this debate about ensoulment. We just know you shouldn't do abortion, period. And even someone like Augustine, he typically holds to basic traditional philosophy. He's got a whole section on delayed ensoulment. He's also got this curious line, which I thought was actually rather moving, where he says, well, even if they haven't had their soul implanted in them yet, we'll still see them in the resurrection. So it's like the child will get that soul, even though it died, it'll be given that soul, and we will see them in the resurrection. So it becomes a really kind of technicality, right? Like the fact that the soul hadn't yet implanted in this life doesn't really matter because it's still a spiritual entity that we're going to dwell in glory with. Yeah, so I don't think the mixed record is a huge weakness. It's something to know about and to wrestle with and to maybe sharpen our own thinking. But there's certainly a uniform distaste and general opposition to any kind of abortion. And then the other rationales will vary.
I can't remember your exact wording, but I like the way you summarize this opposition to killing a thing that will eventually, have a soul in their minds. And you say something to the effect of, God clearly means this to be a human being. He is clearly in the process of making this a human being. And to frustrate that process right in the middle of it is an act of murder, effectively. It's depriving a person of a life that they should have. And that, to me, that seems a little bit different from what we would think of as contraception in modern terms, because when we speak of contraception, we know about the egg and the sperm. So when we speak of it, we're primarily talking about preventing the union of egg and sperm. Now, there are certainly contraceptive methods that pose the risk of killing a fertilized embryo, but primarily what we mean is preventing conception. What it seems like they mean when they're talking about contraception in their pre-scientific world is actually stopping a process that is already in motion, that's already in the middle of creating a human life. Is that a kind of accurate distinction to make?
Yeah, it has to do with their notion of causality. You know a thing by its goal, by the final point that you're working towards. And so you start at the end and then you work your way back. And so that's a big part of what they're up to. Now some of the church fathers, they would say that's the only use of sex at all. And some of them are extremely sex negative, to where they only want you basically they only want you to do this 2 or 3 times and they want you to be done. That comes out in several of them. So I wouldn't want to say, let's agree with everything, every version of their arguments. I do think we have to part of retrieval is also a critical engagement. But we want to be aware of the philosophy, the style of reading, the style of arguing. And anytime we're going to depart, we need to have a pretty strong and confident rejoinder to them, rather than just assume that they're nuts.
This is the process of development that took place is very interesting to me too. And not to raise the ghost of Newman or anything, but the modern Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church going back quite a few generations, has had a very clear stance on the abortion issue. And obviously Roman Catholics, that they emphasize the role of the church fathers in the formation of their theology. Whether or not that's actually accurate to do that is another question, but they would point to the fathers and say, this is the teaching of the church that we have received. It's part of the deposit of faith, and we're making it clear now as in the magisterium. How do Roman Catholics turn the corner from the ensoulment debate to just saying conception? at the moment of conception, that's a human being and killing it is murder?
Yeah, that's a great question because they are going to be more committed to delayed ensoulment historically than the Protestants. Because Aquinas, he's very strong on this. He really plants his flag. And one of my sources, I'm not sure if it made it into the book or not. I haven't looked at all my footnotes. But one source I read is a 20th century Catholic scholar. And he says, well, actually, the delayed ensoulment view, it is enshrined in certain papal statements. Like it can't be just easily dismissed. And I forget which council. I would have to look it back up. It may be one of the Lateran councils, but essentially using Aquinas gives a stamp on it. So how do they deal with it? I think it really is kind of papal fiat. You get a change in the 20th century, essentially, late 19th, 20th century, and then they just make a statement that goes a different direction. This happens within Catholicism. Formally, he who wishes to be saved must submit to the Bishop of Rome. And now that's not the case anymore. They don't hold to that anymore. And even as we're talking about sex negativity, it was formerly the case that they tended to agree with that sex negativity. And John Paul II has really changed that. And now the theology of the body, sex is positive and wonderful. Even natural family planning is often used as a contraceptive. So they do. They make changes and twists, and I'll have to leave that to a Catholic scholar to defend. But yeah, I think it's a pretty strong pivot. Things change, and so they make changes. And that's probably going to be the crisis of Pope Francis. How much change is now too obvious, too inescapable.
But Wedge, as much as I'd like to talk about the kind of metaphysics of the soul and ensoulment for the rest of this podcast, because it's really interesting to me, I think we got to move on to the Reformation itself and the kind of development that happened among the reformers on the issue of abortion, on the immorality of it, and why exactly. So could you sketch a broad picture for us, like you do in the book, of what the reformers believed on abortion and how it kind of developed or differed from what came before?
Sure. So you see mostly continuity. That's one of the things I point out, especially in Luther and Calvin. They don't really feel the need to have a whole chapter on it in their books. They just mention it when it comes up in passing, and they treat it very directly that it's wrong, and they give reasons why. But the difference comes in two real places. The text that they are relying on, the biblical text, they are much more pulling from the Hebrew. So just very shorthand, right? The medieval church largely was using a Latin text that was based on a Greek text, Greek both Old Testament and New. The reformers now, because of the new language and the Renaissance and the recovery of that, they're reading the Hebrew. So that's a big part of it, because a lot of this business of ensoulment and delayed ensoulment, it's connected to the Greek translation. So when they're not using the Greek translation, then sometimes it doesn't even have to come up. It's not even relevant. They don't even mention it. So the Hebrew text becoming normative, that's a big part of one of this a big part of why they are no longer hung up on the question of ensoulment quite as much. And then you see this move to just being, they're more confident in the ability to say the positive requirement of preserving life, thou shalt not kill, has a positive, meaning thou shalt preserve life. You can just push that in a comprehensive manner to all sectors of life. And so for them, the kind of tricky ins and outs questions are no longer as prevalent. They're not pressuring anyone, and they are just going to push their positive moral understanding in a direct way. It's interesting that it starts to ripple out in more of a common law capacity, because whereas in Catholicism in the Middle Ages, some of the issues of abortion would be political and other issues would be handled through the penance system. If it was an early stage abortion, for instance, that would be handled through the church, really, more than the state. But within Protestantism, they're largely doing away with any notion of ecclesiastical law that covers stuff like that. And they're handling this more in the state. And so when you read like Blackstone and his commentary on the common law and the law of England, he tells you about the history of that. And so it becomes more prevalent in civil law as well. And that continues into America into the 19th century. And there's a lot of interesting books being written on this very recently. The author's name is escaping me at the moment, but he's Williams. I believe his last name is Williams. He's a Protestant writer, and he talks about how there was this whole host of people that were opposed to abortion prior to Roe versus Wade. Alan Carlson, formerly of Hillsdale, who's written a number of books on family policy, he's also got a book on the history of this issue in America, and he shows that one of the leading politicians who is against a whole host of moral issues, but contraception and abortion also are on the list, that he is really a literal physical descendant of New England Puritans and is embodying at least one strain of their sort of social crusader legacy. So that legacy plays out into both Britain and America.
So there was this guy I talked with a while back who I guess had a history background, and he was obviously of a more liberal Protestant bent. And he kind of called me out and said, you're just here trying to stand within the mantle of a historic pro-life movement, but that's just a Catholic thing. You evangelicals, going back just very recently in American history, were pro-abortion, and only recently did the moral majority kind of come along, and evangelical and Francis Schaeffer and guys like this, and evangelicals decided, this strain of Protestant in the United States decided that abortion was going to be a big issue for them, just like it was for the Catholics. And of course, I would cite very ancient examples of Christian opposition to abortion like you do in the book. And his response was kind of, well, that's Catholic stuff, but you Protestants, you evangelicals have always been sort of ambivalent about the whole abortion question. The history you're telling is very, very different from the history that this individual was kind of pushing, that the departure is really the 20th century embrace of abortion that happens in American Protestant circles. It's not the rejection of abortion. As a matter of fact, and this is one of the surprising things that emerges out of the book, and we talked about this a moment ago, Protestants had a more robust, refined, and even morally severe judgment against abortion in many cases than the Roman Catholic Church had up until that point, where they're using words like murder with much greater eagerness and readiness. That was interesting to me. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the story that isn't told, because the pro-life advocates are probably wanting to minimize the kernel of the truth there, that there was a loss, a relapse, sort of a falling away in the mid-20th century. So they tend to either not know about that or they don't want to talk about it. But the story is, when you look even deeper, to be deep in history, right? But to be even deeper in history, after the Reformation, you actually see a codifying and a more uniform position on this matter, especially with the disinterest in that conversation of delayed ensoulment. I mean, that's pretty much shifts from being the majority view across all of Christendom to being a minority view by the 19th and early 20th century. So that's happening. And then surprising sources. People might not expect this, but two guys I cite in the book, both Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they are extremely strong on abortion, and they both call it murder.
Wow. That is kind of surprising. You wouldn't associate those figures typically with that. I'll tell you another one, going back much further, another one of the quotations that I have seen before, but I didn't realize the context of it, was Calvin's quotation on the immorality of abortion. And he's basing it on the Exodus passage we mentioned earlier, where it's actually in his commentary. And he's saying, in essence, if it's wrong to kill a man in his own home, how much more heinous is it to kill a child in the womb, which is supposed to be the place of greatest safety? He says it's almost a monstrous crime to do so. And the funny part, that about that part that really catches my attention is the incidental character of the remark. It's not like Calvin devoted this big section in his work to bioethics or something, right? He didn't do that, but he assumes so much when he encounters the abortion issue in Exodus and just, slams it, just says this is wrong. This is uniquely wrong in a way that even a typical garden variety murder wouldn't be quite as heinous.
Yeah, the idea is that this is an individual that's extremely vulnerable, and therefore we ought to be going out of our way to protect them, doing extra to make sure we're not harming them. And they're in a very intimate and ultra domestic, like using that word domestic in sense of home, right? They're in their innermost place, and that ought to be a sanctuary, not a place of murder. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what happened? How did this break down?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's surprisingly quick breakdown because the Southern Presbyterians in the U.S., they're still able to speak on behalf of the entire General Assembly in the 19th century condemning abortion. So it's really like you've got this tightening of the moral view, getting more and more clear on opposition to abortion from the 16th century to the end of the 19th century. And even in the early 20th century, with characters like Bonhoeffer and Barth, their guns blazing against abortion. So, I mean, that's taking you into the 30s and 40s, frankly. But then, boom, everyone seems to kind of forget things in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So, what happened? I mean, it's a great question. I kind of have to just speculate right now. I don't answer that question in my book. But what do we know about that time in history? A few things. One, this is after the mainline kind of fracturing. The Protestants, the fundamentalists and the modernists have had their debates. And though you and I probably, our hearts are with the fundies, they had, they took their stand and they knew what was right and what was wrong. Part of that did include an institutional kind of memory loss, right? People are not at their traditional institutions anymore. They're starting new schools, and they're just not really conveying that older sense of tradition, certainly not as strongly. It's much more about, well, we just read our Bible, we know what we know, and we're fighting against certain flashpoints with the liberals. I think that's part of it. I think also with the modern technology, you have advances in contraceptive technology and even abortion technology, but you don't have as crystal clear advances when it comes to sonograms, ultrasounds. That hasn't happened yet. So I think there's probably also a bit of a tendency to say, hey, we are on this arc of progress technologically, and we have all these new tools at our disposal, and we can handle problems in ways that in the past couldn't be handled, but yet they don't have that crystal clear information that you and I now have where, hey, that heart is beating. This is an actual living child, and we know it. That wasn't so clear yet. So I think that's part of it. And then sadly, I think this is one of those boomerang effects of you had an argument that you were using against an enemy, but you didn't understand how it could work. Some of the conservatives really planted their flag that, hey, it's not the church's business to get involved in politics. And that was a conservative thing because they were tired of what they saw as the social gospel. The civil rights movement had, in their mind, kind of gone way too far. It was kind of like the people today who are opposed to the woke, right? And so they're like, hey, the social gospel civil rights movement, it is meddling. It's getting too far into our business and it's abusing the scriptures. And they would even make arguments like it's binding our conscience, Now, maybe they were right about some of that. I mean, it's a complicated history, but I think they were wrong about a lot of it. And I think they were wrong to just say, like, hey, nobody bring the Bible into these kind of hot button political issues. Just leave that out. I think that was a big mistake. And they really suffered from that. And so that's what you see with a Paul Woolley, who's like, hey, unless you can show me chapter and verse super clear, then you just need to back off. That approach really did a disservice to the church.
So after Roe v. Wade was overturned, a Catholic friend, a couple actually who live right here in our neighborhood, invited us over for a little kind of a celebration, right? The conversation, went in lots of interesting directions, but one of the directions it went in is the connection that my Catholic friends see between the Protestant acceptance very recently, historically, of birth control and contraception and the Protestant acceptance of abortion. What do you think about this? Because there's a sort of logic to it that, and I understand that this is an issue of great contention, but we're here to talk about ideas and all that kind of stuff, and there's nothing off limits. But this is one of those things that Protestants are kind of divided on. I don't think it's necessarily a sort of straight down the line agreement, and one certainly not in the direction of opposition to birth control, but I don't think also in the direction of total support for it. I think there's some Protestant pushback there still. But is there a connection between the idea that we can sever sex from reproduction and the idea that we can sever the, child's life after reproduction has actually taken place?
Yeah, so I want to be careful with this because traditionally the sort of trad view is hey, it's all the same, and look, that's even how the theologians talked. There's something to that. There's certainly a connection and overlap. I also think, though, that we definitely now do have information where we can show at least distinctions of categories. So abortion is terminating a life which has begun. We have boundaries for that, right? We can say the life had not begun until now it did. When the sperm and the egg meet, that really is when it's starting. And so I think we want to definitely maintain that level of a distinction that, hey, prior to that union, whatever's happening, and it could be sin still, it could be immoral, it could be wrong, but whatever's happening prior to that, it isn't the termination of a living human. So I think we want to still keep that clear because that's what the science is going to show us. That's what the medical technology is going to show us.
Right. And we made that sort of distinction clear earlier where we understand that contraception today, at least purely technically speaking, contraception is designed to prevent fertilization, whereas something like an abortion pill is designed to actually end an individual life that's begun.
So I think we definitely want to keep that line very clear, both as, just thinkers, but also within the church, right? The pastoral implications of how people should make their decisions, what sort of burdens are on their minds. Knowing that distinction is very helpful and useful. And we should, no matter what we think about maybe other questions about contraception, I think we need to be very clear as a church to say anything that is presenting itself as contraception, but which we know is actually terminating the life of a fertilized egg, is absolutely abortion. It's off limits. We shouldn't do it. And we need to be very clear and, frankly, a little more assertive about that sort of a thing. And that's going to apply to a lot of other issues, right? In vitro fertilization is one where that's going to come up. A lot of people, they talk about the pill, and there's actually a few different kinds of pills, right? And we just need to get into that more clearly. So that's the first thing I would say, is that there is a distinction where that beginning of life happens. And we need to make that super duper clear and really press hard on that so that people aren't engaging in abortion. Now, on the other side, I think that it is a question of kind of general framework, motivation, goals, value ranking, because within the Protestant tradition, you will have both representatives of an absolute opposition to contraception, and then you'll have people, mostly later, but I think at this day and age, it's the majority, who are going to say, well, that's less clear to me. That's an area where I can see some of the argument, but not all of the argument, or I can think of compelling counter arguments. So I would just say, for our sake, it's one that is not unified within Protestantism, and we pretty much couldn't do anything to change that if we wanted to, right? So we need to work within those parameters right now. But we need to say, you still, whatever your arguments are, however you deal with the ins and outs, the boundaries of that issue, childbearing is one of, if not the first, reason for marriage. I mean, that's the whole point of getting involved in this thing called marriage. That's in the traditional wedding rite, but I think it's even clear in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. And then he says, it's not good for man to be alone. I need to make a helper for him. And the helper just happens to be someone who is sexually complementary, right? So it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking through here to say, hey, Adam's supposed to multiply. He can't multiply by himself, and the helper that is is a woman.
And this is even in the context of the Adam notices his lack because he's just looked at the rest of the living kingdom and said, everyone has their fit partner except for me. What's the deal with that? And what is the purpose of those partners in the living kingdom? Well, it's to reproduce, right? I mean, they don't have emotionally intimate marriages in the elephant. Well, maybe they do, but it's the point is he noticed the lack because of that.
Yeah, and a lot of times in modern Christianity, because we are kind of worried about abuses or being kind of too heavy-handed, we want to say it's primarily this is companionship, right? He needs a friend, he needs a partner. But I mean, he could have gotten a second man, right? And I think most people, generally speaking, when they think of just their general friendship group, it's people of the same sex. But God doesn't make a second man. He doesn't make a bro. He doesn't make a business partner. He makes a woman who is specifically different when it comes to reproduction. I mean, that's the most obvious difference, right? So we got to just get clear on that this is not a side issue. This is not something that like maybe down the road the Christian family could consider. Now, this is up front. So we need to be telling people when you enter a marriage, childbearing is part of the program. Like, there can be situations where it's not possible. You may be infertile, understand. But normatively, if things are in place, in a sort of natural sense, theologically speaking, natural, marriage leads to childbearing. That's what it's for. That's all about it. And we need to be promoting that. We need to be educating people about that connection. We need to be promoting that. And then we need to be making our communities, and that's a little bit of a loose word, right? I'm talking about making our churches, making where we live, our physical conditions, even the material conditions, they need to be the sort of things that promote families and kids. So that all needs to happen. And I think if we could have a much stronger push for that, an integrated pro-family system, then the question of abortion would not even be able to have credibility. It would be so obviously in contradiction to that whole program that we would know that it's wrong.
Right. I think many thinkers have pointed this out, but Mark Regnerus is the one who kind of stands out in my mind as having pointed out the moral dilemmas created with the introduction of reliable contraceptive technology, chemical, medical interventions to prevent conception, where you have this category in our minds that wasn't there before, the category of the intentionally companionate marriage that is that way, is childless solely by the choice of the individuals who got married. So that conversation we mentioned earlier with Matt Walsh and Joe Rogan kind of uses the childless marriage as like a wedge to try to say, well, what's wrong with gay marriage? Because lots of people get married and decide they just want to travel the world and, take pictures together and go to concerts and art museums and whatever. And Walsh says, okay, yeah, I recognize people do that, but what they want there is not the historic definition of marriage, because childbearing, the intent and openness to childbearing is part of that historic definition. And of course, Rogan didn't like that very much, but that's the point you're making.
We should also just challenge, why do you need to be married to have a companion who goes across and sees sights and travels the world? Why does that require marriage? And I certainly would be surprised if Rogan is for lifelong marriages, right? He's probably very okay with easily severable marriages. But marriages were traditionally lifelong for a very clear reason: to protect the woman and the children, right? Because if the man can leave, then he historically is going to leave.
I forget who it was who really turned me on to this and helped me understand this, but you grow up in a culture like ours that has been shaped by the contraceptive mindset, and you really do have this category sitting in your head of the companionate marriage. But that simply wasn't possible, at least not reliably, before a certain very recent point in history. To engage in sexual intercourse until very, very recently was to invite children. That's what happened. And so marriage emerges naturally. It really does. It really is part of the human family's basic programming to protect the woman and the child who results from the union, because women are incredibly vulnerable in that situation. When they have a child, that's an enormous life-changing burden. What are we going to do with that? What burden are we going to impose on the men who have sex with women and get them pregnant? Well, marriage is the answer to that. With contraception, though, things change. And that's where I kind of see the force of that, what would be a traditionally Catholic argument, like something has flipped in our minds and we need to unflip it to think rightly again.
But this is not the only place in which technology does this, right? Because we now have capability of travel, relocation, that's upending whole communities and societies. And there is an attractiveness to just saying, well, let's undo all of that. I could feel that attractiveness. But you also have to have the reality that, hey, it's not going to happen, right? We live in this world now. And so the church it can sort of just try to fight against it by denying the reality, or it can say, well, this is what's been thrown our way, and you try to make strategic and effective arguments. Now, there are plenty of Christians who are going to just say, no, it's wrong to have contraception. I admit I go back and forth on that question, honestly. I was not raised in a tradition that taught that, and something I'm kind of learning as I get older. So I can see the force of that. I can also see arguments, though, that like, is it really the case that like if you were having lots and lots of children in rapid succession, that's going to be very bad on the mother's health, right? It drains her calcium, she loses hair sometimes. And so is it really the case that God would not want us to use technology that could harness or alleviate some of the negative effects of our fallen nature? So that would be a conversation to be had. And then the question, and I think the answer has to be, well, yes, we can do that. And so the question is then, well, what's a responsible way to do that? Is there a moral way? So that's kind of where I'm at in my own thinking. So I'm largely for, the bulk of my energy is to get people pro-family and pro-children. But then I also want to say we do have this technological question in reality that is, at least within Protestantism, a matter of division, unclarity, and we've got to continue to wrestle with that. But given the limitations of our reality, what can we as a church do, right? How can we still be positive, proactive, forming people? And I think that if we have just lots of Christians being very positive and optimistic towards families and children, then the bulk of the problem will be resolvable. You'll just use your Christian prudence and you'll be trying to do the right thing. Largely, you will do the right thing. What we want to avoid are people using technology in order to cancel out or minimize their duties in order to kind of have a quick fix to get them off the hook of responsibility. So we want to broaden their imagination and get them understanding the more coherent vision of love, family, and children.
So there's a lot more to say there, but I want to move on to our kind of final subject here, and it is the political duty to engage on the issue of abortion specifically that we have now, and then how what we've learned about the Protestant witness on this question, which is really, a piece of the Christian witness, the whole big historical Christian witness on this question, can inform our political engagement. We're recording this just a couple of days after a pretty disappointing election for pro-lifers. A lot of ballot initiatives in several states were really swatted down by the voters that would have been more of a pro-life character. And several states actually more deeply entrenched abortion with constitutional amendments and ballot initiatives. So the abortion issue has gone before the voters, and the results have not been pretty. We have a lot of work to do. But looking at the Protestant tradition on this issue, what can it give us moving forward to engage this issue publicly? Because this isn't just a thing for Christians. This is a justice issue for society as a whole.
So, yeah, I think we have to be realistic about the state of the country. The battle of Roe versus Wade was judicial. And so by nature, that's not democratic. That's not popular. That's an elite action about the state of lawmaking. But because of that, it allowed people, I think, to just not interact with the reality that, if you poll the country, basically the majority view is going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to be opposed to, no restrictions at all abortion. They don't want late-term abortion. But they probably a significant majority does want early-term abortion to be legal. for sure. And we've got to just know that. And the Republicans, the people in the leadership of the Republican Party definitely know that. And you'll see certain, I mean, DeSantis, he wasn't really talking a whole lot about this issue, right? This was definitely way down the list for him. And that is important. That's intentional. So what we've got to do is teach, educate, and persuade. Because currently the idea that you're just going to pass a bunch of laws, that is not realistic. That's kind of cope. So we've got to teach, we've got to persuade. We've got to start with our people, because frankly, I bet if you were able to get a true poll, even of PCA, certainly with Anglicans, broad evangelicals, it would not be 80 or 90% unified pro-life. It would be much more split, and I think people need to be honest about that. So we got to teach our people. And what's helpful about the Protestant social teaching and the approach of the book is we're not just hitting them with one or two verses. Hey, here's a verse. See, now shut up. We're giving them a philosophical framework. This is why not only this verse, but that verse and the other verse and this set of positive duties that you already believe in, why they all work together to lead to this conclusion. So we're presenting not merely one rule out of many potential rules, but we're presenting an entire framework, vision, lifestyle, an approach to community being. And that's what we got to do. We got to start with our people, and then we got to push it out into the broader community and show that it really makes sense and that it's good. Along the way, we can use other tools. We can show the negative effects of the current marketplace. There's a lot of work being done by feminists right now, actually, of all people. Louise Perry, her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, definitely worth interacting with. You should interview her. She presents herself as a feminist, but frankly, sounds pretty trad. She argues that the sexual revolution has been bad for women. They're frankly being ripped off. So we can use tools like that and say, hey, it's actually not proving to be super effective for boosting women. Because what happens is the sexual revolution requires women to conform to masculine standards in order to excel and have true success. And so we need to press that point as well. And they need to be together, both our positive vision and showing the criticisms, the negative aspects of what we have currently.
And this book really does present a positive vision. And I picked the abortion chapter, both because my friend Steven Wedgeworth wrote the abortion chapter, and also because it's kind of the issue that everyone thinks of in Christian circles when they think of Christian engagement in politics. Like that is the one issue with the power to get out the vote, even when you look at the candidate and he's not super savory, or even when you just feel disillusioned with the whole process. If unborn lives are at stake and you can plausibly change the outcome by engaging in politics, as has unquestionably happened before, then you ought to do so. And so that's a good jumping off point for the whole discussion of the Protestant social teaching and then political engagement more broadly. So if you want to say real quick a word about the book as a whole, you wrote the introduction, and I plan on having at least another of the authors, the chapters on. But what do you want to say about this book, and what are you hoping to accomplish with it? What are you guys hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, so I want to just recommend all the other authors here. I really enjoyed the article on just war. Mark Levitch did a great job there. Thought Eric Hutchinson's essay on law was very good. Colin Redimer and Joe Minich take on the question of like labor unions, probably not something that we're talking about that much. So there's just a lot of very interesting things in there, things that people should, I hope, just dig into and learn more about. It's not just one topic. It really is trying to broach the whole range of social and ethical questions. So that's a big part of it, broadening our imaginations when we talk politics, and then being more confident with the tradition. Hey, as Protestants, we're not actually running away from the early church in the Middle Ages. We are inheriting it and carrying it on with confidence. And it's not because we're playing catch up and, oh, we're panicked now, we need new tools. This is actually what our fathers in the faith did. And so we're being more like historic Protestants when we do this. And so I really want that to get out there. And I hope it can be a resource to pastors, educated lay people, something that really has relevance to our life today.
I just get the picture when I read something like this of Josiah discovering the dusty, book of the law in a back corner somewhere under a sheet of the temple and going, why aren't we reading this? We need to be reading this, and bringing it back out for the people. And that's kind of what it seems like you're hoping to do with the Protestant tradition. Well, my guest today has been Steven Wedgeworth, Anglican rector in South Bend, Indiana, and author of a richly informative chapter in the new book, Protestant Social Teaching, an Introduction. I urge you to check out the rest of the book. There's a lot of good resources in there, like we said. Hopefully, I'll be having at least one more of the authors on in the future. Steven, thanks so much for joining me on Upstream. I enjoyed this a lot.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.